You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
We're standing in front of the home of Albert Coenraetszoon Burgh, who was essential in the appointment of John Maurice de Nassau-Siegen as Governor-General of Dutch Brazil. The choice of Maurice leading the Dutch colony in Brazil initially was not the most obvious one. The Dutch West India Company had been less financially successful than its counterpart, focusing on the East Indies, so to shore up its financial strength, they looked to Dutch Brazil for its value, even the company's main hope for commercial success. But why did the West India Company appoint to its most valuable colony a man who not only had never been overseas before, but who also had no experience in managerial or governmental positions? More so, Maurice was so inexperienced in commerce and finances that he had nearly bankrupted himself in building what we now know as the Mauritshuis, his stately residence in the center of The Hague. From the Brazilian perspective, the West India Company demanded a man who could act as a neutral intermediary between the army commanders and the political councils, while from the Dutch perspective, political realities demanded a man whose appointment could be interpreted as representing company support for the pro-war party surrounding the court of the stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelders, roughly the modern Dutch province of Gelderland, and Overijssel, that is Frederick Henry, the Prince of Orange. This war, of course, was the war for independence from Spain, where both Dutch chartered companies as extensions of the state and colonial enforcers of what some were hoping would be Dutch hegemony in distant lands stood to financially gain immensely, with state-sanctioned piracy being a significant source of income for both West and East India companies. In fact, the West India Company had been founded in large part to pursue the war against the Iberian enemies in the Atlantic, so continuation of the war was a crucial aspect of this company's existence. John Maurice filled both the Brazilian and the Dutch requirements very well. On top of that, it appears that Maurice's appointment, after an endorsement from the Amsterdam politician Albert Coenraetszoon Burgh, whose house we find ourselves at, was proposed as part of a political move for Burgh to entrench his position in Amsterdam and to cement his connection with the Prince of Orange, which eventually saw Burgh end his career as extraordinary ambassador to Muscovy, or Moscow, in 1647. Burgh had fingers in many pies. At the solemn entry of Maria de Medici, then the Queen Mother of France, into Amsterdam in 1638, Burgh welcomed her in the name of the city's government, and she was set to listen to a speech written by Caspar Barleyus, the later biographer of Maurice, where Burgh offered her an Indonesian rice table, in those days very exotic and hardly known to Europeans. He also sold her a famous silver rosary captured in 1629 by Piet Hein in Salvador de Bahia. How appointing Maurice might have been a marriage of convenience is also underscored by it appearing that the position of the title of the Governor-General was essentially a transposition of the Dutch office of the stadholder, and that the West India Company seemingly designed its office of Governor-General primarily to suit its candidate, rather than looking for a candidate to fill a pre-existing vacancy. Strengthening this hypothesis, Maurice was the only Governor-General ever appointed by the Dutch West India Company. In addition to more easily convince Maurice to take up this position, he was allowed to retain his military role back in the Netherlands, and retaining this position meant that he would have a job upon his return to the Netherlands, but also that in the years to come he would not just serve the company, but by not breaking this military connection, also the Dutch state. Meanwhile, though technically the Dutch colony was run by a council, with Maurice taking up the primary role within it, in contrast to the Council of the East India Company, this council was small, totaling 4 members, including Maurice, which meant, as Maurice could function as a tiebreaker, he always only needed one other council member on his side to get his way. And because, as per design, Maurice was personally the commander-in-chief of the army and naval forces in Brazil and allowed to appoint army officers on campaigns, his position was a powerful one, indeed reflecting the role of the stadholders back in the Netherlands. By late August 1636, Maurice had set sail for Brazil with 4 ships, quite a bit less than the 32 ships initially promised to him. This gap between promises and reality would become typical of the relationship between the motherland and colony in the years to come. Grand promises of help and support, but with only limited realization. Nevertheless, leaving with, amongst others, physician Wilhelm van Milanen, preacher Franciscus Plante, and cartographer Johannes Vinkboons, Maurice took to the Brazilian water like a fish, perhaps even finding his calling in these lands beneath the equator. Burgh, Maurits's benefactor, who had put in a good word for him at the West India Company, died on Christmas Eve 1647 in Novgorod, not too far from Moscow. In the 1660s, a fort captured by the Dutch from the Portuguese at Elmina in Ghana was rechristened to Fort Coenraetszoon Burgh in honor of the once mayor of Amsterdam.